Hey everyone, today we're going to be sewing the Harmonie blouse/dress by Atelier Scämmit, and we're going to be using our sloper to alter the pattern to fit us perfectly. That will be covered in the first half of the video. The second half of the video, we're actually going to cover the construction of the dress, so stay tuned to learn more. This pattern has three main pieces for the bodice: the front, back, and a yoke across the shoulders. I traced all three of these pieces and removed the seam allowances. The pattern also uses gathers along the front and back shoulders and the waist. The first thing we needed to do is alter the pattern so the shoulder widths are only as wide as they will be once the gathers are pulled. To do that, I measured the difference between the bodice shoulders and the yoke and use the difference to create a dart. Once the dart was cut, I created a slash line near the bust line to allow the shoulder dart to collapse. Now that the gathers were taken care of, I cut the yoke at the notch that divides the front and back and taped those pieces to the bodice. First, I pinned the shoulder and bust darts, but left the rest of the sloper darts open because the bodice doesn't have much shaping. Lay the sloper on the pattern so the centers are aligned, and then slide the sloper up and down until they match where the shoulder intersects the neck. I have a really wide shoulder area, so this technique doesn't work. Instead, I match them at the bottom of the arm side. The first thing on the commercial pattern to alter is the length. I needed to shorten the bodice a few inches. Next, add or take away width as needed. I added 1.5 inches total to the center back, giving me 1 inch of positive ease. Since I added ease, I needed to remove some of the width at the top of the shoulder. I used the sloper to mark where the seam should go and graded the arm side. I like to alter my garment in steps, so that's it for now, and we'll see how the bodice fits. All darts need to be untaped and the yoke put back together before tracing the muslin pieces. Since we don't have any seam allowances, I trace the pattern as is, cut a generous seam allowance, then sew over my chalk tracings. You could probably get away without sewing, but I'd rather be safe than sorry if the chalk rubs off during handling. My sewing book had a tip to wrap the gathered threads around a pin to keep them secure, and it works so well. My try-on also went well, and I didn't need to further alter any of those pieces. Once I was confident the main bodice pieces fit, it was time to alter the accessory pieces. This included the waistband and the front and back neck facings. I'm not sure what happened, but the back neck piece ended up being 1/2 inch too long, so I fixed that right away and altered the pattern piece. I altered the sleeve cap by measuring the difference between the arm side and the sleeve cap, making sure to account for the gathers. Next, I wanted to know where to add this length. The sleeve cap marked where the top of the front and back bodice pieces were supposed to stop, so I could line up the notches and walk the arm side to the edges. Half of the length was added above the notches and half below. I did this by using the inflection point of the sleeve cap and lowering where it curved, as well as extending the edge of the cap by the seam allowance. I'm not sure I'll ever sew another sleeve that lines up so perfectly with the markings. With the bodice 100% sewn, further alterations I made included removing 1 inch from the waist and 1.5 inches from the sleeve bottom. After resizing, I went back and made part of the skirt and removed 5 inches from the bottom of that. I bought this gorgeous hand-woven fabric from India since this is going to be a summer dress. However, it was way too see-through to be worn alone. I purchased a Bodice to go underneath, and it's still slightly sheer, but it works for summer. To prep the striped fabric, I ended up serging all the edges because, like with any hand-woven fabric, it's going to fray quite easily. I then created an underlining by hand basting the 2 fabrics together. I have a short video about this process that will be linked above. I added an extra layer of Bodice in any area that called for interfacing except around the pockets. That's the only area I did use a lightweight fusible interfacing. There was so much prep work to be done before I could actually sew this garment together, and the last thing I needed to do was to stay stitch around the neckline and the armholes. Make sure to stitch close to the seam allowance, but to not go over. I'm not going to lie, it took me an entire day to figure out the pocket directions, so I'm going to cover them in a little more detail here. First, sew the French seam around the pocket curve. Then, take 1 skirt front piece and 1 pocket and line up the notches with right sides together. Make sure the pocket will be able to open once it's on the inside of the dress. Stitch with a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance between the notches of the pocket. Then cut the fabric to the stitch line at the notches. Fold the seams of the cut area so they are hidden and press. Next, top stitch out 7 millimeters starting where the folded area is, then along the pocket opening and down the other side to make a 3-sided stitch line. Now I needed to attach the pocket to the back skirt piece. Pin the front and back pieces together with wrong sides together and stitch at 7 millimeters down the entire length. Open the skirt, press and trim excess fabric within the seam, and sew the second seam line at 7 millimeters with right sides together. This was a little daunting over the pocket opening since I didn't want to accidentally sew it shut. The pattern uses really tidy finishes on the inside, with most seam allowances being finished with bias binding. I have to say I really liked how they turned out and they were really easy to do. I did sew the sleeves without underlining, and I used extra tracing paper underneath the fabric for extra stability. I really wanted to highlight the difference between the unfinished seam compared to the beautiful bias bound seam. The only area of the dress that I didn't use a French seam or a bias binding on was on the inside of the neck facing. For that seam, I used a serger since it's completely hidden anyways. I did have one buttonhole mishap where my thread broke, and I salvaged it by using different zigzag stitch widths. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned lots about using a sloper to alter your commercial pattern, as well as being inspired to sew this beautiful dress for summer. If you've enjoyed this video, please subscribe and ring the bell to be notified when my next video is released.